Hi, it's Carolyn. I'm here to help you learn how to bake and decorate amazing cakes. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to decorate this Fortnite cake. And I was only going to do the box, but I decided to film the entire thing. So this video is pretty long. I am going to link chapters below for you to make it easier to skip to a certain part of the video. Now I'm starting with my cakes already baked, filled, iced, and they are in the refrigerator waiting to be decorated. I have tons of videos showing you how I do that whole process, and they will be linked below. And I will also link below any other videos that I reference and all of the tools that I use. So let's get started. All right, I got my 4-inch square cake out of the refrigerator. It's iced in buttercream, and I need to measure how big I need to make the panels, and I want to cut them too big, that way I can cut them down to size. So I think I'm going to do them about 6 inches by 6 inches to make sure I have enough space. And I'm going to put that back in the fridge. Now, all of my fondant has this Gum-Tex powder, Tylose powder, CMC powder. It's all basically the same thing. You knead it into your fondant, roll it out, let it sit, and that Tylose powder is going to let the fondant set hard and make it so much easier to work with. I only use marshmallow fondant. You get the best result if you use the Tylose powder with the marshmallow fondant. I have a little bit of blue, a little bit of purple, and black coloring, and I want to color this like a darker navy blue. So I'm adding a lot of blue, a little bit of purple, and a teeny bit of black, and I'm going to knead this all together to see what color I get. And that still looks a little too light, so I'm going to add some more color. So we're doing a lot of blue, a little bit of purple, and a teeny bit of black, and I'm going to keep doing that and knead it together until I achieve a darker navy color. And since I added so much coloring, I have to add some Tylose powder because the coloring really softens the fondant. And look how smooth that Tylose powder makes the fondant. I just love it. So I'm sprinkling down some cornstarch, and I'm letting that fondant sit for about 20 minutes before I start to use it. Now I have a cake box lid. I always cut the lids off of cake boxes and use them for things like this. I'm going to sprinkle down some cornstarch, and I want to roll this fondant out, and I'm rolling it out about 1/8 of an inch thick. I want to smooth it with my fondant smoother, and I just want to cut a straight edge on the bottom. You can see how thick I rolled it out there. And remember, I wanted to cut these 6 inches, so I'm lining that 6-inch down on the bottom straight edge, and then I made a dotted line with the top of the ruler so I can get a 6-inch high piece. So I'm marking this at the 12, at the 6, and at the 1 so I can get these pieces to be 6 inches wide. So I mark that at the 6 and at the 1, and I'm just going to cut these squares. And remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm cutting these bigger than they have to be. That way I can cut them to size later, so it doesn't need to be perfect. So I have my ribbon cutter here. One side has a little nub in here, one side doesn't, and whatever pieces you put in between the discs is how wide your ribbon will be. So I'm just figuring out how wide I want this to be. And I'm not cutting ribbons out, I'm just making impressions in here so I can get this look of wood planks. So I realign that left disc on the line to make sure that I am making these impressions equidistant. And then I'm going to do that for both of them. And then I have my Dresden tool, and I'm using the curved end just to deepen those lines that I made with the ribbon cutter. And now to get this wood look, I'm just making dotted lines at various lengths up and down these planks. And I try not to have like 2 openings next to each other. That's just me being a little OCD. And then I'm deepening those lines again with my Dresden tool. And I did that for both of them, and I'm going to set that aside. And I made 5 of these because there are 5 panels on that cake. Now again, I have this Gum-Tex powder mixed into my fondant. I have a piece of non-slip pad underneath my cutting board, an X-Acto knife with a wet paper towel, a Dresden tool, and a little bit of water. And I measured this, and I printed it out the size that I wanted it to be. I rolled that yellow fondant out really thin, and I am doing my trace, cut, and smooth method on here to create this. So what I want to do is take my Dresden tool and trace all that lettering on there, making sure I don't press too hard. I don't want to poke a hole in the fondant. I just want to transfer the lines on there. Then anytime I cut anything out of fondant, I always cut those center pieces first and smooth them with my tools. It's just so much easier to cut those center pieces out before the rest of the letters is cut out. And I messed up that O, so I just had to make another one. And then once I have all the center pieces out, I'm going to cut all of the letters. And anytime I cut anything out of fondant, I have to take my fingers and my tools and smooth my cuts, just because the fondant is a little jagged and you want it to look nice and pretty. So I'm going to realign all those letters on top of that picture so they dry to the right shape. And that looks good. Now I have some green fondant and I am tracing this onto the green. So I printed out 2 pictures that were the same size because the letters are drying on the other one. So again, trace, cut, and smooth. And I'm just marking where all those letters are gonna go and where those little 4 corners are. And then I have these ball tools here. I wanna have the smallest ball tool and I'm just deepening those little impressions. And again, I just wanna cut this out and then smooth my cuts. And then realign that on the picture so it dries to the right shape. Now I have some black petal dust and I'm looking at the picture. Do you see how the bottom half is kind of darker than the top? So I'm just kind of coloring it in so it can match the picture. And this color really transfers. So I'm tapping it in the lid and I'm making sure that I don't have too much on my brush or else it'll be difficult to blend it in. And then I'm flipping it over, I'm getting water on the back, and then I have that gray fondant rolled out really thin, and I am slowly placing that down there so air bubbles don't form behind it. And then I want to take my tools and straighten it. And there is a little impression here that needs to be done where those dog tags are. And I totally forgot to do that when I was tracing the green piece. So I'm trying to line this up exactly where it's supposed to be. And I'm just taking my Dresden tool and tracing where the rope part is supposed to be so it can sit into that piece of fondant. You'll see what I mean when I do it. I'm taking my Dresden tool and just deepening that, and then I need to cut an even gray border around this entire thing. So I'm just getting real close and carefully cutting the border. And then once that's cut out, I take my fingers and I smooth my cuts. Now I want to do the dog tag. So I'm tracing this onto the gray fondant. And then the one underneath, you have to look past that piece. So do you see how it's behind that front one? I'm going past that and trying to imagine what it looks like as it's sitting behind that. So I have 2 rectangles. And then I'm tracing this little gun here and cut it out. And in order to make the little trigger, I just make a hole with my needle tool. And then I'm cutting out the axe as well. And then I want to take my ball tool and just create a little impression here. And anytime I push fondant down like that, I got to flip it over and take my X-Acto knife and cut the excess off of the back. And then I want to cut these little dog tags out and again, smoothen my cuts. And then I'm going to get some water behind the gun and the axe and stick that down. Now I started filming this in time lapse and then for some reason my phone cut out. But you could see what I did with this lettering. I did the same trace, cut, and smooth on here. So I traced those FORTNITE lettering on here and then I put it on a piece of black fondant and I cut it out to look like the picture, and here's what it looked like. I'm going to line that back on the picture to dry. And now I have this clay gun with a really tiny hole in the disc. I'm lubing it up with a little bit of shortening. And then I put that green fondant in the microwave and I'm rolling it out so the fondant is really soft and pliable, and screw that disc on. And then I'm just squeezing this out. And I'm going to let that dry. And now I want to color in the letters. So I have that terracotta dust, and if you look, the top of the letters of the word battle and then the bottom of Royale are colored. So I'm just trying to make it look like the picture. It's not really orange in the picture, but whatever, it's close enough. And then I'm putting the lettering on here and I'm not gluing it down. I just want to make sure it's in the right position. And then I need to get that rope on here. So I have a really tiny head on this paintbrush and I'm just getting water in those indents there. And I have some Rollcomb Super Silver powder. This will be linked in the description. And I already have some powder in that cup and I add a little bit of lemon extract and I mix that together and it forms a little paste, and then I can paint the back and the front of those dog tags silver. And then I'm just going to take my fingers and remove the excess silver as well. And then I cut that rope to a point so I can easily thread these dog tags on there. And I'm looking at the picture. That axe one is first, so I'm threading that through first, and then I'm putting the one with the gun behind it and carefully sliding that on there. And now you can see how this rope is going to fit down in that indent that I made. And I just want to make sure I get them in place. That's why I have the picture close and I wanted to make it look like the picture. And I'm cutting the excess rope off, and now I can put that other lettering down. So I put the letters down first so I can make sure they're in the right place before I put some water behind it and glue it down. And then after it's all glued down, I like to take my fingers and my tools just to make sure they are all in the right place. And I want the dog tags to stick to that sign as well, so I'm just getting a little bit of water behind that. And I'm tucking that excess behind there and align that on that picture to dry. And that FORTNITE, it's only going to touch that Battle Royale sign at that bottom part, so I got a little bit of water down there and stuck that down. And I don't want it to dry, so I'm putting it in a Ziploc bag so it stays pliable, and let's set that aside. Now, I did this in a time lapse, and I'm doing the same trace, cut, and smooth on here. So I trace the face on here, I take my Dresden tool and deepen the detail, and I cut it out and smooth my cuts. Then I did the same thing for the legs, and I'm cutting them out. And then what I want to do is put this on a thicker piece of white fondant so I can get a skewer underneath it. So that white fondant is rolled out, I don't know, about a 1/2 inch thick. And then I want to carefully cut this piñata out before I put the little ruffles on here. And to make the ruffles, I cut a strip and then I cut little triangles underneath it so it kind of looks like those piñata strips that are on there. And I just started at the bottom and worked my way up. I got a little bit of water behind all of them and just stuck them to the piece. And now I want to get a skewer underneath here. That's why I rolled that white fondant out really thick. I wet the skewer and I'm screwing it in there. You don't want to jab it in because you don't want to mess up the fondant. I'm just making sure it's not poking out the front or the back. And then I want to color this in. So it looks like the ears and the snout is a little bit dark purple. So I'm just coloring it in with some purple dust. And then I need to make the little tail. So I'm just cutting a bunch of ribbons out of fondant and smoothing my cuts, and look, they're going to go off of the back like that. So that looks like the right size. So I want to cut 2 more of those. And I'm going to get a little bit of water behind the part that's going to stick to the back. And then I want it to wave, kind of like the picture, so I'm just pushing it up and down. And this fondant is holding its shape because it has that Tylose powder mixed into it, so I can form it and it will stay in the right position. And let's realign that on the picture and set that aside to dry. Now I'm making this little fish guy, and again, I measured him out the size that I wanted him to be, and I'm doing the trace, cut, and smooth method to create him. So I'm tracing that shirt onto this blue fondant. Make sure you get that inner detail. And then I'm taking my Dresden tool to deepen those lines before I cut it out. And after I cut it out, of course, I'm going to take my time and smooth my cut. So I'm going to do this for this entire thing. So now I have some orange fondant, and I'm tracing all of the orange on here. And then again, taking my Dresden tool to deepen any inner lines and cutting it out, smooth my cuts. And you can see how that shirt fits on there. So I'm going to do that for all of these pieces. Trace it, cut it, smooth. And now I have some thin white fondant rolled out, and I want to piece this together. So I'm getting a little bit of water behind that orange piece, and let's stick that down. And then I'm looking at the picture and I'm just piecing it together. So I'm getting that blue shirt down there, and then the brown hat and the brown detail. And you just want to look at the picture and make sure you're putting everything in the right place. Now I have some darker orange dust, and I'm just coloring it in to give it a little depth. I feel like pebble dust just bring your pieces to life, and it makes them not look so flat. So it's totally worth the investment to use some pebble dust and color everything in. Then I'm just getting a little bit of water behind all of these pieces, taking some dust to bring out the detail in the mouth. And then I have this little piping tip and I'm cutting the eyes out and cutting a little hole for that little white detail that looks like the picture. And then again, I want to get really close and cut an even white border around this entire piece. Once that's cut out, do I even need to say it? I'm going to take my time and smooth those cuts. And that looks good. Going to set that aside on the picture to dry flat at room temperature. And now I need to make these little wooden plank pieces for the box. So I rolled that blue fondant out pretty long. You can see how thick it is. And then I'm taking my ribbon cutter and I'm not cutting the ribbons out yet. I'm just making those impression lines like I did before and creating that wood detail in here. And now that I have that wood detail in here, I'm taking my ribbon cutter and cutting those out. So the reason I didn't cut them out and then do it is because as I added that wood detail, it would have distorted the ribbons. So I wanted to do that first before I cut them out. I'm taking my rulers and straightening all these so they dry straight. Now I got my cake out of the fridge. We're going to stack it. That icing is solid. I'm not going to mess it up. I have my sewing ruler. I'm just measuring how tall I need to cut the straws, and I'm putting the straw up on the ruler and marking at the end with a Sharpie marker. And then once I have all of them done, I'm going to cut that marker off and throw that piece away. And then I am offsetting this to the back of the cake. So I'm putting the straws in the cake, get a little bit of icing down. Then I got that cake out of the refrigerator. I'm going to remove the tape, and then that cardboard is going to sit atop of the straws. It's going to prevent the cake from collapsing. Now I do have a full stacking tutorial, and I'm going to link that in the description where I go into full detail on how I stack my cakes. I'm making sure that that cake is center and there's an even space on either side. I'm cutting my dowel to size and then hammering it through both cakes into the cake drum and covering that hole with some icing. Now I need to cut these to size, and I hope I can quickly explain this. I do have a video where I go into detail on how I do this, and I will link it below. So I have that fondant smoother on the left side. I'm starting in the very back of the cake, and I need to see how small I need to cut this first plank. So I'm putting the fondant smoother on the other side, and I want it to go just inside of that fondant smoother. So it's going to be 4 3/4 inches wide, and then all of them are going to be the same height. So I need to measure how tall this cake is to make sure I cut them the correct height. I don't want them to be too short, so it needs to go over the top of the edge just slightly. And it looks like I need to cut them about 4 1/8 high. So now I have this L square, and this allows me to cut perfect edges, perfect 90-degree edges. I want to make sure that center plank is center. So again, I need to cut this about 4 3/4 inches wide. So I'm just centering that to make sure that that middle plank is center, and I'm just marking the left side with my X-Acto knife and then the right side at the 4 3/4 inch mark to make sure that I cut this to the right width. Now I have that L square, and I'm going to line this up close to the bottom edge because I want to cut from straight edges. So I'm cutting up that left side where I made that mark on the left side with the ruler. And I just get really careful when I get to the edges. That way I don't distort the fondant in the corners. And then I keep that L square in the correct position and then cut that bottom piece. So this is going to be a perfect 90-degree angle on this plank. So now I am aligning on the left side with that straight edge I just created and marking with my X-Acto knife at the 4 3/4 inch mark. And I'm making like three of them so I can create a dotted line. Turn it 90 degrees, and that left side is that bottom straight edge that I cut, and this is how tall I want it to be. And remember, it was 4 1/8. So I'm just aligning the left side of the ruler with the straight edge and making a dotted line at the 4 1/8 mark so I can connect that dotted line with my ruler. Now I'm getting my L square out again, and I'm aligning the left side on that straight edge that I cut, and the top I connected those 3 dotted lines that I made so I can make sure that I cut this to the correct height. And I go through it a couple times just to make sure I get a clean cut. And then I'm going to turn it again, align that left side with that straight edge that I cut, and the top part I'm trying to connect those 3 dotted lines that I made to make sure that I cut this to the correct width. And again, I'm really careful when I get to those edges. And that looks good. Let's take it over to the cake to make sure that I cut it to the right size. So I'm starting in the back. You always want to start in the back. And I'm putting that up here. And it looks really good. So what I want to do is just get a little bit of icing on the back of this to make sure that it can stick to the cake. I don't need too much, just enough to make it stick. And then I'm carefully trying to center that along the back section of that square cake. I'm using my fondant smoother to press it on there. And remember, that icing is hard. That cake is just out of the refrigerator, so I'm not going to mess that cake up as I do this. Now I want to do the same thing. What I want to do is measure the 2 side panels first and then measure the front. So I'm aligning that ruler with the very back edge of that panel that I just put on. And then I want to have it come right behind that fondant smoother that I put in the front. So this was bulging out a little bit, so I took a knife and I'm cutting this icing down just so I didn't have a big bubble, and whoops, I removed a little bit of it, so let's stick that back down there. And you can see how hard it was for me to cut that icing off. That's how solid the icing is right now. So my ruler was bulging out a little bit. It wasn't lying flat. That's why I wanted to get rid of that excess icing. So you could see if it comes right before that fondant smoother, it was like just before 5 inches. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I have my L square. I'm going to cut straight edges first. So I'm getting it pretty close to the edge and just making sure I have a perfect 90-degree angle to start with. And then I want to take my ruler, line it up with the left side, and then mark just before the 5-inch mark to make sure that I have the correct width. And then again, it's going to be the same height. So I'm going to turn it again and make sure it's 4 1/8 inches tall. And again, I'm going to do a dotted line. And then I'm lining my L square up with a straight edge on the left side, connecting the dots on the top and cutting that off, and then turning it and aligning the left side with the straight edge and connecting the 3 dots and cutting that off. And let's bring it back to make sure that it fits. So I'm aligning the left side to overlap to the back of that back panel. So I'm getting a little bit of water on the sides where it's going to touch, and then get a little bit of icing down. And then I'm going to press the water against the water so that seam really holds. And then using my fondant smoothers just to make sure it's all straight. And let's do the same thing. So I have that fondant smoother in the front, which is mimicking that front panel. And I want it to come to the edge of that back panel. And I believe it was just under 5 inches again. So I'm taking my L square, and first I want to cut that straight 90-degree edge. And then I can take my ruler and make my dotted line, making sure it's just under 5 inches wide, and then turn it and make sure it is 4 1/8 inches tall. And then again, I'm going to take my L square, align the left side on the straight edge, and the top part is going to connect the dots that I made. And good, let's take this back to the cake, make sure it fits. And that looks really good, so I'm going to do the same thing. Let's get a little bit of icing down, and then I want to get a little bit of water on the seam for both pieces. And then I'm just carefully pushing this against the cake, and I'm making sure that that seam looks nice and perfect. Using my fondant smoothers to push it against the cake, and that bottom corner was coming in a little too much. I want to make sure that that is perfectly vertical, so I just pulled it out a little bit. Now this front panel goes across both, so I want to cover both of those side pieces, so it's just going to be just over 5 inches, and I did the same thing. Like I cut it to the size like I did before, and this time I want to get some icing down, and I want to get some water on both pieces and then both sides behind that front panel. And let's stick this on, and it looks perfect. So I'm just using my fingers to make sure that I have those seams glued together, and use my fondant smoother to make sure everything is straight. Now we want to do the top piece. If this is a perfect square, then it should be the same the entire way around. And it was just, I think it was 5 1/8 inch and 5 1/8 inch. So I ended up making a perfect square. I cut it and that looks like it's a perfect size. So when you put the top piece on, you want to make sure that entire top section of the cake is filled in with icing, because you don't want that top piece to cave in a little bit. So I'm making sure the icing goes all the way to the corners and it is completely even with the top of those panels. And then again, I want to get a little bit of water down on the panels and then on all 4 edges of that top piece so it can glue down. And I'm making sure I have the cake facing forward, and I'm putting that top panel so the lines go from front to back, and just pressing the seam together. And then I want to see how tall I need to cut these little wooden planks. It's about 4 3/4 inches tall. I'm slightly out of camera frame here, but I'm just holding the ruler up here and cutting those little lines that I made earlier. Get a little bit of water behind it. And I'm starting in the back again. So I'm doing this around all of the edges. So I'm starting on the back left side. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the right. This time I'm just holding it up, seeing how tall it needs to be, making a little mark where it needs to be cut, trimming it to the right size, making sure it's the right size, and then get some water behind the back and stick that down. And then I want to do the pieces in the middle at the top and the bottom. So let's see about how long it needs to be. They need to be about 4 inches long. Cut the piece, make sure it's the right size, get a little bit of water behind it and stick that down. So that top seam is coming to the very top of that top panel. And then doing the same thing for the bottom. So do you see how I'm just holding it up, making sure it's the right size first before I put the water behind it to glue it down? So I start in the back, then I go to one side and I'm going to do the same thing for the one side, and then I'm going to go to the other side, and then I will finish in the front. So I always want to do the front last. So I'm holding it up there, cutting it to size, get some water behind it and stick it down. So I pointed to the front of the cake. I want to make sure that I don't do the front until the very end. And the reason being that those front pieces cover those seams that are on the side. And then I want to do the same thing for the top of the cake. And then I'm taking my little ball tool again and just creating this little detail on all of these planks that I put on here. So I'm doing one on each end of every plank. And look how good that looks. Let's put that back in the fridge. Now I want to make the drop sign. So I printed this out the size I wanted it to be. And all these pictures that I use will be linked in the description. That yellow fondant is rolled out really thin. And I'm doing the trace, cut, and smooth method to create this. So I'm tracing all the letters on that yellow fondant, cut them out, smooth my cuts, and realign it back on the picture. I don't want it to dry, so I'm sticking it in a little Ziploc bag until I'm ready to put it on the cake. And now I rolled out this white fondant really thin, and I want to do the same thing for the name. So I printed that name out the size I wanted it to be. And to find his name, I just Googled Easton graffiti name and found images. I clicked on images and I just found one that I like. So this isn't a certain font, it was an image that I found. So again, I want to cut out those center pieces and smooth my cuts, and then I will cut the rest of the name out. So before I do that, I want to take my Dresden tool and just deepen the inner detail. So I'm keeping this all as one word. So anywhere the letters overlap, I just want to deepen the detail so you can tell what the word says. And then cut that out and remove that excess fondant. I'm going to set that on a sheet of paper to make it a little easier for me to smooth my cuts. Realign that on the picture so it dries to the correct shape. And that looks good. I'm going to keep that on there so it could dry to the right shape. I have my airbrush machine here. I love this thing. So that little dial on the left controls the pressure of the spray. There's an on-off switch. I have some yellow, green, and blue airbrush coloring. You must use airbrush coloring in an airbrush gun. Just getting a couple drops on there. You do a tester spray first to make sure it's not going to spray everywhere. And I'm doing the very top of the letters with the yellow, and then I rinsed that out under hot water, and then I added the blue in there, and I'm doing the bottom part blue. And sorry, I'm a little out of frame here. And then I'm doing the middle section green. And I need to set that aside for at least a half hour so that ink can dry. Now I got that cake out of the refrigerator and I want to airbrush that top block, so I need to take some plastic wrap and put it on the cake so I can protect the bottom tier from getting airbrush all over it. So I'm just pushing it right up against that block and making sure that fondant is exposed. Then I'm getting some black airbrush coloring in this airbrush gun, and I have a little paper towel here so I can do a tester spray. And I'm just kind of outlining all of the edges with some black airbrush coloring. Now, the trigger in my airbrush gun was a little tough, so I ended up putting a little too much black airbrush coloring on here because I would pull it back and nothing would spray, and then all of a sudden airbrush would come out. So I was a little annoyed at it, but it still looked good. So what I'm trying to do is making sure that I get on all of the seams and I get those little planks in the inner detail. And I have to disassemble my gun and just let it soak so I can clean it, but I'll do that next time. Once I do that, then the trigger won't be so tough. So you can see how the airbrush coloring really just brings out the detail in this box and just makes it look so much better. And that looks really good. Let's put that back in the fridge. Now I'm rolling out the border. So I have this black fondant. I'm rolling it out really long. I'm making my ribbon the correct size I want it to be and just cutting a strip here. And then I have my cake right out of the refrigerator. I have a wet paper towel and I'm just cleaning the cake board. Then I have some piping gel and I'm getting piping gel around the bottom perimeter of the cake so the border sticks. I'm starting in the back, wrapping it around where it comes together. I'm just cutting the seam and pressing that together. Then I like to take my palette knife and just press that down to make sure it's down onto the board and it's really even. I'm getting a dry paintbrush and just removing any excess cornstarch. And now I want to put this drop word on here. So I'm getting a little bit of water behind it. I have the picture close so I can make sure I'm getting these in the right position. And I'm just pressing these down lightly so I can adjust them. So the water didn't dry yet, so I can use my finger and just slide these to the correct position. And I'm using my tools to make sure that they are nice and even. Then I got that Battle Royale logo out of the bag, so it's still pliable. I'm getting piping gel around the very edge, and then I like to get a little bit of icing in the middle. The icing really solidifies when I put it back in the refrigerator, and that thing ain't going nowhere. So I'm just making sure that's centered to the front, and I'm pressing that down. And that looks really good. Let's put that back in the fridge. Now I have some thin black fondant here, and I want to get a background on this name. So I'm flipping the name upside down. That ink is dry. I'm getting a little bit of water on the back, and then I'm taking the black fondant, I'm flipping it over so the good side is facing down and just transferring that on there, and voila, it's transferred to the black fondant. And I'm taking my X-Acto knife and cutting an even black border around the whole thing, and then just taking my fingers and my tools to smooth those cuts. And I'm just going to set that aside on a cutting board so it can dry flat. Now I'm making a little camouflage number 7. So I have a bunch of different colors here of fondant, and I'm just haphazardly putting it together, if you will. And then once I have enough, I'm going to roll it out. And you can see how it kind of mimics the look of camouflage. And I am tracing this number 7 on here. So this number 7 is in my favorite numbers PDF. I have a PDF that has all of my favorite numbers that I like to use, so I will link that in the description. Then I traced it on there, cut it out, and smooth my cuts. And then I want to put it on a black background. So I rolled that black fondant out. You can see it's like 1/4 of an inch thick. I put the number 7 down, and then I'm lifting it up and getting a little bit of water underneath and sticking that down. Now this is a thicker piece of fondant. Anytime I cut anything out of thicker fondant, I do a guideline first. So I'm just sticking the tip of my X-Acto knife into the fondant to create a guideline. And then once I have that guideline created, I'm going to stick the tip of the knife all the way down to the cutting board and cut this out. by doing it this way, I don't mess up the top edge of the fondant and everything looks so much better. So I flip it over and I'm smoothing it from the back, and then I smooth it from the front, and I set that aside so it can dry flat. Now I'm making this little first aid kit, so I'm doing the same trace, cut, and smooth. I hope you guys aren't getting bored. So I traced it onto the fondant, cut it out, smooth my cuts, and I'm literally, you know what I'm going to do. I'm doing the same thing for all of the pieces on the different colors. And make sure that you take your Dresden tool and create any inner detail if you need to deepen any of the lines. I put that on there and I'm cutting it to size. And doing the same thing for the red pieces and that little plus sign as well. And then I want to paint that part silver, so I still have some of that Rolcom Super Silver with the lemon extract, and I paint that on there. Then I get some water on the back and carefully put that down. I'm going to tuck the ends down onto the side and make sure that it is perfectly straight. And then I'm just piecing all of these other pieces on here, so it looks like the picture. And that looks good. Going to set that aside so it can dry flat. And now I want to make a tree. So I need to add a little bit of Tylose powder to this green fondant so I can set really hard. And I'm rolling it into a ball, then setting it down onto the countertop, and I'm rolling it into a cone shape. So it's pointier at the top and flat on the bottom. And then I want to get a skewer in it. So I have a skewer here and I'm just screwing that in like I did before. And I have a styrofoam block and I'm just going to set that in there so it can dry for about, I don't know, an hour or so. And then I take these scissors and I'm making the little tree detail, if you will. So I'm cutting a bunch of different pieces in here to create this effect. And that looks good. I'm going to let that dry in that styrofoam block. Now let's decorate this. I got that out of the refrigerator, so everything is solid. I'm getting a toothpick in that other leg of the piñata. That way it's not going to twist when it's in the top of the cake. And I'm doing the same thing for the tree. Let's get a little bit of icing underneath the tree and the feet of the piñata where it's going to touch the cake. And I want to hold them up to see where they're supposed to go. So let's stick the tree down first, and then I'm going to stick the piñata down. And as I push that down, the icing kind of spread out. So I'm taking a dry paintbrush and a paper towel, and I'm just removing that excess icing that's sticking out to clean it up. And now I want to put the name down. So I'm getting a little bit of icing behind the name and sticking that down. And I want to see where I want to put these guys. So I'm holding him there. Do I like that there? Should it go up top? No, that looks stupid. I'm going to keep it down on the bottom. Okay. And then I think this should go right there. That looks good. So I'm paying attention to where it's touching the cake and getting a little bit of icing underneath it. And then I'm pushing it down so it can adhere to the cake. And then again, I'm going to take my dry paintbrush and scrape out any excess icing that's sticking out. I'm paying attention to where that's touching the cake and getting a little bit of icing behind it. And then I'm going to press it down. And again, when I put that back in the refrigerator, the icing is going to solidify and it's really going to glue that to the cake. So again, I am removing the excess icing with my dry paintbrush. And I'm going to do the same thing for the number 7. And here is the cake. How awesome is that? So there you go. How cool is this cake? This one was so much fun to make. And I think I said in the video, I do have another tutorial where I go into detail on how to do that paneling method. So I will link that in the description below. I hope I explained it well enough for you. But the majority of these decorations are made using my trace, cut, and smooth method. And I am going to link all of the pictures that I used in the description for you so you can use them if you decide to make this cake. I edited this video down to about 40 minutes or so, but it took way longer to decorate. Just to decorate this cake was probably about 8 hours. But the inside of this cake, the top tier is a 2-layer, not torted 4-inch square cake. And the bottom tier is a 2-layer torted 9-inch round cake. And I have a video where I talk about when I tort and when I don't tort my cakes, and I will link that in the description. And it feeds about 35 to 40 people. So I think that's it. What new techniques did you learn in this video? I would love to know. Leave it in the comments below. And just a reminder, I do have a Cake Academy membership program where I can help you elevate your cakes to the next level. All of that information is listed in the description. Please like this video if you liked it, and if you are enjoying my tutorials, I would be so grateful if you could buy me a coffee. My link is down below. And I would love it if you would keep in touch on socials, and you can check out my website. And if you want to stick around, you can watch this video next and hit subscribe and the bell if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I love you guys. And remember, it's cake, have fun. I will see you on the next one. Bye.